One of the most poignant and confusing moments of the Odyssey, Homer's epic poem about the hero Odysseus' 20-year journey home after the Trojan War, occurs near the end of the poem. Odysseus has finally made it back to his home country, and he sits in disguise, face to face with his wife, who's been waiting for his return for nearly 20 years. When she asks the stranger who sits in front of her to declare who he is, Odysseus pretends that he traveled with her husband as a crew member and a soldier. He describes his own travels as if he merely witnessed them. And then he makes several oaths, swearing that her husband will return. In this moment, he chooses not to disclose that he is, in fact, her long-lost husband. But in one striking speech, while he's still concealing his identity, Odysseus declares, "Dry your tears and hear me, because I speak the truth without concealment." This is a telltale moment in the story of Odysseus. He's a master at intertwining truth and deception. Homer even opens the Odyssey with the line, "O goddess of inspiration, sing to me of wily Odysseus, that master of schemes." Today we'll look at Odysseus as the flawed Greek hero celebrated in the Odyssey and in other material from the so-called epic cycle, long-lost poems related to the Trojan War. We'll pay particular attention to the ways that Odysseus' scheming and his lies lead to heroic triumphs, and how they also nearly kill him. Odysseus, who is also known by the Latin version of his name Ulysses, was a legendary king of ancient Ithaca, an island located in the Ionian Sea. There's some disagreement about his parentage. According to legend, Odysseus' mother was Anticlea, and Homer tells us that his father was Laertes, a Greek king. A different tradition, however, states that Odysseus was the son of Sisyphus, an ancient king of Corinth, who was said to have been punished by the gods by being forced eternally to roll a heavy boulder up a hillside, only to have it roll right back down the hill, forcing him to begin the task all over again. The rest of Odysseus' life, however, is described fairly consistently. Odysseus was married to Penelope, and together they had a much-beloved son, Telemachus. Odysseus is hailed as a hero in the Trojan War, and like the Trojan War, there are debates as to whether or not he actually existed. Those who believe that the Trojan War actually happened usually date it around 1200 BCE. So if Odysseus really lived, it was over 3,000 years ago. The Odyssey begins when most of Odysseus' adventures are already behind him. Homer drops us into the story when Odysseus is near the end of his journey, after being held captive by the beautiful nymph Calypso. Now, Calypso has kept him on an island as her lover for nearly 7 years, but as the epic opens, Odysseus is about to be offered the chance to leave. Despite being nearly shipwrecked by a storm sent by Poseidon, for reasons we'll talk about later, he makes it barely alive to another island known as Phaeacia. His hosts offer him a ship to Ithaca, but first they ask him to describe his past journeys before he leaves. And we get to eavesdrop on these stories. This is how we learn about his adventures. In addition, as the Odyssey begins, Odysseus' grown son, Telemachus, is searching for news of his father. Men who served with Odysseus in the Trojan War describe his bravery and his cunning, and they encourage Telemachus not to give up on his long-lost father. Between the stories told to Telemachus and Odysseus' own reminiscences, we learn about Odysseus' past. There aren't many stories about Odysseus' childhood. He first attracts attention as a young man when he woos the beautiful Helen of Troy. When the Spartan king Menelaus finally wins Helen as his wife, Odysseus wisely encourages the king to obtain pledges from her former suitors that they will defend his marriage rights, to battle if necessary. It turns out, though, that when Menelaus tries to collect on these promises, Odysseus himself balks. When Helen is abducted by Paris, Menelaus sends a representative, Palamedes, to Odysseus' homestead in order to recruit him for war against Troy. But Odysseus has married Penelope by this time, and he has an infant son, Telemachus, so he's reluctant to leave his family. In addition, Odysseus is aware of an oracle prophesying that if he leaves for war, he will not return home for 20 years. This prophecy sets the stage for the rest of the epic. Odysseus learns that Palamedes is on his way, and in a characteristic act of cunning, Odysseus decides to pretend that he's gone crazy. In effect, he disguises himself as a madman. He goes to extreme lengths, first sowing his fields with salt, which renders the fields completely useless for farming. Then he harnesses a goat and an ox to his plow. These animals are mismatched, and so they pull the plow haphazardly while Odysseus pretends to urge them on. But if these acts are supposed to convince Palamedes that Odysseus has lost his senses, Palamedes does not fall for the trick. In a kind of dare, Palamedes picks up Telemachus, Odysseus's newborn child. Palamedes places the baby in the field directly in the path of Odysseus's plow blade. In effect, he challenges Odysseus to prove his lunacy by driving a plow straight through his own son's body. Odysseus steps away from the plow in despair, acknowledging that he has not, in fact, gone mad. In Apollodorus' version of the story, Odysseus bemoans his fate as he sets off for war, and he never forgives Palamedes for forcing him to go. The stories continue with tales of Odysseus' service in the Trojan War. Once Odysseus joins Menelaus' army, he is 100% committed, and his cunning serves him well. His first act is to recruit the great warrior Achilles to the cause. Now, the prophet Calchas had declared that Troy would never be taken without Achilles' help. However, Achilles' mother had been told that her son would either die young as a hero at Troy or live a long, unremarkable life at home. Now, this choice may sound familiar. Remember that Heracles was offered a similar choice, and in characteristic fashion, he chose the harder path. But Achilles' mother is not anxious to send her son into danger. Just as Odysseus tried to trick Palamedes in order to avoid battle, Achilles' mother tries to trick Odysseus in order to save her son from going to Troy. Achilles' mother disguises the warrior as a young woman, and she sends him to live with King Lycomedes, hoping that he will blend in with the women in the king's household. But Odysseus, remember, is the master schemer, and he suspects a trick. He sets up a trap in order to trick Achilles into revealing himself. Odysseus offers gifts to the daughters of Lycomedes' household, gifts such as gold and jewelry and fine dresses. But he also includes weapons in this collection of gifts, and Achilles betrays himself by focusing on the weapons rather than on the traditional women's gifts. Then Odysseus unexpectedly sounds a battle horn, and Achilles instinctively grabs a weapon and a shield, girding himself for battle. And in doing this, he reveals himself. This makes it possible for Odysseus to recruit Achilles, who is absolutely essential for victory against Troy. Odysseus is also responsible for the famous deception known as the Trojan horse. Now, we'll go over the details of this story in a later lecture when we talk about the Aeneid. But, in short, after 10 years of warfare at the siege of Troy, the Greeks pretend to surrender and they depart. They leave behind a huge wooden horse as a kind of peace offering. Despite warnings, the Trojans ultimately are convinced to bring the horse inside the city gates as a kind of a war trophy. The next night, 50 Greek warriors, including Odysseus, emerge from the wooden horse and they attack. And with this move, the Greeks finally conquer Troy and the long war ends. Both of these stories showcase Odysseus's chief qualities, his cleverness and his bravery. Throughout the war, these qualities serve him well. But when the long war is over, he turns his face toward Ithaca. And at this point, Odysseus' scheming becomes a problem for him. He and his men begin to suffer as a direct result of his cunning and his pride. It's worth lingering over this point for a moment. The very skills that make men like Odysseus effective military leaders often create problems when they're off the battlefield. It's as if heroes aren't really comfortable when they're not heroing. Imagine General George Patton without his command. Odysseus displays cleverness even when it's not called for, and what he considers acts of bravery come across sometimes as misplaced arrogance. As a result, the prophecy is fulfilled, and it takes 10 more years for Odysseus to return to his home and his family. In the Homeric material, Odysseus' stories focus on the years after the war and his efforts to return home to Penelope and to his son. These stories are perhaps the best known stories about Odysseus because they're the most entertaining. They include monsters, gods and goddesses, and the underworld. Early on, Odysseus and his soldiers are captured by the Cyclops Polyphemus, a one-eyed giant. Polyphemus is cast in the role of a barbarian. He's lawless, he lives apart from society, and he ignores traditional Greek rules of hospitality, which would oblige him to shelter Odysseus and his men as guests. Instead, the Cyclops begins to eat Odysseus's men 2 by 2. At this point, Odysseus must rely on his cunning to maneuver and escape. Odysseus makes Polyphemus drunk with wine, and while the Cyclops is asleep, Odysseus and his men ignite a large wooden stake, and then they drive it into Polyphemus's eye, blinding him. At this point, the men are still trapped because the Cyclops blocks the entrance to his cave. He only lets his sheep in and out of the entrance to graze, and he runs his hand over the back of the sheep as they come and go, just to make sure that none of Odysseus's men ride away on them. Odysseus and his men escape by clinging to the underside of the Cyclops' sheep as they move in and out of the cave, cleverly eluding detection. Odysseus and his men escape because of Odysseus's clever thinking. But at the last moment, Odysseus's pride gets the better of him. As he begins to sail away from the Cyclops island, he can't resist bragging a bit. So he shouts out his name, declaring, "If any man should ask you who blinded you, shamed you so, say that Odysseus, raider of cities, he gouged out your eye, Laertes' son who makes his home in Ithaca." Well, the Cyclops then tells his own father, Poseidon, what Odysseus has done. Poseidon is already irritated with Odysseus, in part because they were on opposite sides in the Trojan War. After Odysseus blinds Poseidon's son, the Cyclops, Poseidon himself becomes enraged. He works systematically to make it very difficult for Odysseus to return home, throwing obstacle after obstacle in his path. Homer writes, "All the gods had pitied Lord Odysseus, all but Poseidon, raging cold and rough against the brave king until he came ashore at last on his own land." At this point, Odysseus's adventures become increasingly discouraging. At one point, Odysseus and his remaining soldiers come right within view of Ithaca. Exhausted, Odysseus collapses into sleep on the ship. His men, who have been told to keep a special sack tightly closed until they have arrived safely home, greedily open it, thinking it must contain gold or treasure. In fact, it contains all the ill winds that would have kept the ship from returning to Ithaca. These winds are released when they open the sack, and Odysseus and his men find themselves driven away to the island of the sorceress Circe. Odysseus's journeys also become increasingly dark. Eventually, like Heracles, Odysseus and his men travel to the underworld. The spirit or shade of Odysseus's dead mother tells him that his wife is being pursued by suitors who claim that Odysseus is dead, and they're competing to take over his wife and his home. Odysseus resumes his journey home, avoiding the dangerous sirens, the mermaid-like creatures who take on the forms of beautiful women and sing so enchantingly that sailors literally steer their ships into the rocky shores of their island, rather than turning away from the siren song. After escaping the sirens, Odysseus and his men also navigate successfully between the monster Scylla and the whirlpool Charybdis, but only at great cost. Odysseus continues to lose his soldiers one after another, and he's ultimately trapped absolutely alone on an island as Calypso's captive. It's here that we meet him at the beginning of Homer's epic. At this point, Odysseus is not the confident war hero. Now he's the lonely wanderer who wants nothing more than return home and to his family. Once Homer has brought us up to speed, the story begins to move forward, but at this point with a hero who is very much changed. After being released from Calypso's island and nearly drowned by Poseidon's storms, Odysseus is brought, naked and alone, to the Phaeacian shore. When Odysseus finishes telling this long story to his Phaeacian hosts, they deliver him finally to Ithaca, but he doesn't return in triumph. As a precautionary move, Athena disguises the mighty king and war hero Odysseus as a poor beggar so that no one will recognize him. After decades away, we find Odysseus walking the noisy streets of Ithaca, determining how best to reclaim his family and his throne. He meets his wife without her recognizing him. Now, Penelope loves her husband, and she's a loyal wife. So throughout the years of Odysseus' absence, Penelope has remained faithful. But she and her son have been invaded by princes desiring to take over Odysseus' kingdom and to take his wife. And Penelope can no longer withstand the pressure to remarry. Some scholars argue that Penelope notes the resemblance between the beggar she encounters and her long-lost husband, and so she devises a plan to draw him out. Other scholars argue that Penelope simply tries to devise a strategy to delay choosing a second husband, without realizing that she's actually setting up the perfect opportunity for Odysseus to reveal himself. In any case, Penelope tells the disguised Odysseus that she can no longer put off her suitors. She must choose someone to marry. In order to select her future husband, she has decided to hold a competition among her suitors. The suitors will be required to string Odysseus' bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads. Whoever can fulfill this task will have her hand in marriage. Odysseus, of course, immediately decides to participate in the contest. While awaiting this event, Odysseus is recognized by Penelope's maid Eurycleia. Penelope asks Eurycleia to bathe his feet and to anoint them with oil. Eurycleia, who was Odysseus' nurse when he was just a child, recognizes a scar on Odysseus' leg that he got when he was hunting as a young man. And in a poignant moment, the woman recognizes Odysseus at once, and she reaches out her hand to touch his face. But Odysseus stops her, and he silences her that she will not give away his identity prematurely. Odysseus swears her to secrecy, and he waits for the competition. The day of the contest, suitor after suitor tries to string the bow, but fails. And finally, Odysseus steps up. He strings the bow, and he sends the arrow flying through all 12 axe heads. And then, with the help of his son Telemachus and the goddess Athena and others, he attacks and he kills all the suitors who have presumed to take over his household. Then, Odysseus orders the servant women who slept and plotted with Penelope's suitors to clean up their corpses. And then he actually hangs these women. And finally, he reveals himself directly to Penelope, who still can't believe that her long-lost husband has finally returned. When he asks for a place to lie down, she tests him just one last time by ordering a servant in his presence to move Odysseus' bed out of their wedding chamber. Now, Odysseus declares this can't be done because he actually built the bed decades earlier, and he built it around a living olive tree. At this, Penelope accepts that this man truly is her husband, and Odysseus is restored to his home and to his family. Why have the stories of Odysseus stood the test of time? At a basic level, it's obvious. Odysseus's adventures are incredibly entertaining. After all, Odysseus battles with gods and monsters, and he always emerges victorious. He is admired by men, he is desired by women, and throughout he stays faithful to his people and to his family. He's the ultimate leading man and adventure hero. This is the stuff of bardic entertainment. Remember that most of these stories began as oral traditions, so they were filled with imaginative elements to keep the listener's attention. For the ancient Greeks, the story of Odysseus was a little bit history and a little bit hero worship. Odysseus' story, even if it's not literally true, puts Greek history on a cosmic stage. It suggested that the gods cared enough about the Greeks to intervene in their lives from time to time. Now, note that Odysseus was not half god like Heracles. Whatever his parentage, he was a mortal like the rest of us. Therefore, as a hero, Odysseus set a standard against which all other men were meant to measure themselves. Most heroes weren't worshipped like the gods. They didn't receive sacrifices or have festival days established in their honor. But the gods existed in another realm. No one could aspire to be a god. Heroes like Odysseus, on the other hand, set a high but an attainable bar. Odysseus was George Washington, General Patton, and Douglas MacArthur all rolled into one. At another level, the Odysseus stories give us real insight into distinctive ancient Greek mythic themes. The theme of cunning and scheming runs throughout Greek mythology. It was a valued trait in Greek citizens. In addition, as classicist John M. Bell notes, Greek myth is preoccupied with identity. This is part of what distinguishes it from mere folk tale. The Odysseus myths explore identity in distinctive ways. Unlike other Greek heroes, Odysseus changes his name, and he conceals or alters his identity several times throughout his adventures. At one point, he even calls himself a Cretan, in effect calling himself a liar. He even takes on the name Nobody in his exchange with the Cyclops Polyphemus. And in a cruel twist of fate, the one time he actually proclaims his true identity as he and his men are escaping from Polyphemus, it endangers them all. Bell argues that at this moment, the folk tale about a man escaping a monster actually becomes a true myth. The mythic hero, even at the risk of endangering his own life and his men's lives, must assert his identity. This story becomes loaded with additional meaning, and it takes on significance beyond the events it describes. Throughout Odysseus's entire life, his identity is alternately concealed and revealed, concealed and revealed. This finally comes to an end when he returns home to reclaim his household and his own family. More than any other Greek mythic figure, Odysseus searches for a place and a time where he can be publicly at peace with his full, true identity. And this personal search may be the key element of the Odyssey that distinguishes it from other Greek myths. More than any other character, Odysseus disguises himself and takes on different personalities. One by one, the sailors under his command, his traveling companions, fall away, ultimately leaving him alone and exposed. He finally returns home, disguised as a person at the very bottom of the social order. He's been humbled, stripped of companionship, and stripped of any meaningful identity. Only at that moment can he come home and resume his rightful identity. It's somewhat of a paradox. The grand epic is ultimately a deeply personal story of one man losing himself and then finding himself again. At a deeper level, I read Odysseus's journeys as metaphors for experiences in everyday life. True, most of us are not tempted by sirens, But the sirens represent temptations that we do face, temptations that initially seem attractive and that encourage us to turn away from a long, difficult path. The story of Odysseus' escape from the sirens reminds us that it's nothing new to be tempted with short-term pleasure, and the seduction will be short-lived. Similarly, when Odysseus and his men traveled to the western edge of the world, or to speak with the dead, these journeys are metaphors for the times that we feel far from home, separated from comforting friends and family. In the Odyssey, Odysseus finds out in the underworld that his mother has committed suicide and that his wife is being besieged by suitors who want to take over his throne and his family. At that moment, he's filled with a new sense of urgency about returning home. Joseph Campbell, the famous myth scholar, called these belly of the whale experiences. Like the biblical figure of Jonah, who was swallowed by a whale and seemingly at the end of his life, Odysseus travels as far away from home as humanly possible, literally to the underworld, to the land of the dead. Only in this dark, womb-like and tomb-like place do Jonah and Odysseus come to terms with their true circumstances. Campbell argues that we all have these moments when we recognize that the old world we used to cling to is gone, and that it's time to move forward toward a new world, whatever that might be. It's important to note that when Odysseus was born, his maternal grandfather gave him his name, which means the son of pain. He declared that this was a name the boy would earn in full. I think we're supposed to hear this as a warning that Odysseus will experience great pain in his life. He certainly experiences physical pain, but in many ways this is the least significant. In fact, the only mark of physical injury that stays with him is the scar on his leg that he got as a young man while hunting. This is a scar of innocence, of youth, and it reconnects him to his family when his old nursemaid recognizes him because of that scar. The implication is that Odysseus' physical challenges in the Trojan War and in the long journey home are fleeting. They're secondary to the truly lasting changes that he undergoes. I think, though, that we can also think of Odysseus as a son of pain in the sense that Odysseus as a man, his character after the 20-year journey, was forged out of pain. Odysseus' true pain is reflected in his stories of the journey home, stories in which his own pride and his attempts at shrewdness cost all of his men their lives and delay his own return. Physical pain is nothing to a hero. But the pain of being faced with the frailties of your own character, being faced with the losses that others have experienced because of your failings, that's the hero's pain. And Odysseus' character as a mature man is born out of this pain. I think Homer hints at this by not telling Odysseus' story directly or in chronological order, but by inviting his listeners to eavesdrop on a mature man's reflections on the past 20 years of his life. By most estimates, Odysseus would have been about 25 when he left for Troy, a young, virile, powerful man in the prime of his manhood. But 20 years of war and wandering mature this man, and we meet him in his middle age, physically a bit past his prime, but much wiser. In the Odyssey, Homer structures the story so that he tells the tale of the telling of a tale. Odysseus' retelling of his own adventures, his reminiscing, is as significant as the contents of the stories themselves. It's a story of personal transformation, and Joseph Campbell argues that it is in particular the story of a hero's transformation. Now, Campbell's approach to myth has its problems, but I do find it helpful in understanding the Odyssey. The hero's journey, or as Campbell refers to it, the monomyth, includes 3 parts. First, the hero separates from his known world, either voluntarily or by force. Then he encounters a world previously unknown to him, and he undergoes a kind of initiation, where he's introduced to unimagined wonders and forces in the world. He survives this initiation, but he's transformed by it, and he subsequently returns to his former world as a wiser man. In Campbell's thinking, Odysseus was the quintessential hero, forced against his will to take on a dreaded task, separated from loved ones for decades, matured and humbled by his experiences and his own flaws, but then reborn. Near the end of his journey, Odysseus washes up on the shore of an island, completely alone and completely naked, like a newborn. Over the past 20 years, he's been stripped of his friends, his allies, and his dignity. He experiences a kind of rebirth, or at least a rite of passage, as he's changed from the proud warrior into a thoughtful man. Odysseus has tasted both the pleasures of Calypso's island and the darkness of Hades, and he re-enters life in Ithaca a new man. The figure of Odysseus has inspired many other stories throughout the ages. Odysseus appears in ancient Greek plays by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and he's a key figure in Virgil's Aeneid. In modern times, he's the focus of Tennyson's poem Ulysses, in which the protagonist leaves his son to rule the Ithacan people as he sets sail on one final journey beyond the sunset. He also appears in the form of Leopold Bloom in James Joyce's famous novel Ulysses, making a journey comparable to the epic 20-year journey, but all in a single day. The Odyssey is also said to have inspired the Coen brothers' film, O Brother, Where Art Thou? What is it about Odysseus' story that draws us back to it again and again? Fundamentally, I think the answer is that Odysseus is both the mythological Superman and everyman. Initially, Odysseus comes across as the hero of a fantasy adventure. His adventures are not the adventures that most of us face in the real world. He matches wits with terrifying creatures such as the Cyclops and the six-headed monster Scylla, and he triumphs. He's the original MacGyver, determining how best to use whatever is at hand to fashion his escape. He's a man's man in a woman's fantasy. He battles armies and dangerous creatures like an action hero, consistently defeating his enemies and constantly fending off the advances of beautiful women. But as his story unfolds, he becomes more like every man. Every reader can relate to his lifelong commitment to family and home, to his struggle between desire and duty, and to his acknowledgement that his strengths are occasionally also the cause of his undoing. Odysseus' journey is our journey, and ultimately his goal is always to return home. In this, he embodies what we like to think are basic human impulses, and he's rewarded much as we all would like to be. He returns home from his labors, welcomed into the loving arms of his family, scarred, but a little wiser.